I am so glad you decided to watch this video. This is one that everybody needs to watch. If you know somebody who hasn't watched it yet, say, man, you got to watch this video. Especially if they're thinking of doing any kind of calligraphy. Doesn't matter which font, doesn't matter which type design or calligraphic hand, the subject of spacing is so important. And by spacing, I mean the space between strokes, the space between letters, the space between words, and even the space between lines of type. All of these are so important. And in each individual alphabet, you'll notice if you've gone through one of the alphabets, we don't talk about it at all. I just give you how to do the letter B and the C and the D and so forth. Now let's talk about how important it is to get the spacing right. Let me give you a couple, I just want you to be educated. So let me give you a couple terms so that you'll know what it is we're talking about. When we talk about the distance between letters, there's a good old word for that, and the word is kerning. So if you see that somewhere, you know that that's what that means. When you talk about the distance between lines of type, this goes all the way back to actual literal hot lead typesetting, and the word for the distance between lines of type is in fact leading, Leading, and it referred to how many little shims of lead the typesetter would put between one line of type and the other. And it's kind of funny how I know some of these terms are becoming more archaic now, but for more than a century, the word leading still meant the same thing, even though we'd stopped using lead, of course, a long time ago. Now, let's go all the way back to the beginning, and it doesn't really matter which font we're talking about. You have to get the space between the letters right, and I know you all know this, but let's just have a chuckle for a second. How many times have you ridden down a country road somewhere and somebody's made a sign and they thought, by golly, I know how to get the spacing right, I'll measure. And so they put, like 1.5 inches between every letter. And it's pretty hilarious looking because it doesn't look right at all. There is no mathematical formula. First of all, understand that. Okay, it's not like one pen width or something. No, nothing like that works, because some letters are more airy, open than other letters, and other letters obviously are more dense. If we're talking about a basic typeface, not black letter or Old English, Chancery, certainly Uncial, even in Times Roman. What's the most dense letter? Here's a quiz. Dun, 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 dun. The most dense letter? The most dense letter, that's right, is the letter I. Why? Why? Because, gang, you can't get any more denser than that. It's complete 100% black from one side of the letter to the other. It's kind of a trick question. But let me get untricky just for a minute. What are some of the more dense letters that are not just one shaft? And that would be the letters W and M. You can tell just by looking at these. To a less degree, N, S. These are all, and by the word dense, I mean dark. There's a lot of ink inside the boundary of that letter. Does that make sense? Now let's talk about what are some of the less dense letters. Well, here's one of the least dense letters. Why? Because that letter T goes all the way from here to here, right? Inside that square, and inside that there's a very tiny little bit of black mark. Does that make sense? As opposed to the Y, as opposed to the I that goes from here to here, and in between those, it's 100% black mark. So you'll see that you can't get your spacing right just by measuring. It's an eyeball kind of thing. You want eventually to have your letters, and this is true of every font. If this is your word, some word that you're writing takes up this space, so there's a number of letters in there. You want your word to be equally gray. Can I use that term? If that's let's say that's about a 15% gray screen there. You want you want your word to be equally gray, 15%, from beginning to end. Now that's going to be a bit of a challenge because you're going to have letters like T, I, M, and then more open letters like T and O and so forth. So you're going to manipulate the letters. You're going to shift some to the left, some to the right, so that you get this kind of evenness. Does that make sense? That's the main principle. It's a visual thing. It's not mathematical. You have to do it with your eye, and it'll take practice. Now, I think you know this already, but I want to make sure that you understand that's part of the reason why many of us, most of us, all of us, most of us, when we're doing a calligraphy project, that is, we're doing something we want to really hang on the wall or a certificate, you will actually do the practice writing on a separate piece of paper and then make your adjustments, trace that probably, get it closer, trace it again, maybe even trace it a third time before you go to your final piece of artwork. Does that make sense? Because you're working out things like kerning, spacing between letters, spacing between words. Now, what I said about words is the same with what I said about a single word is the same about a line of words. You want there to be equidistant, even though there's little breaks in between the words. You want there to be a symmetry. You don't want a great big gap here and a little skinny gap here. In some alphabets, we may have talked about this in the specifics, some alphabets are characteristically, the gaps between the words are smaller. Uncial, for instance, there's less of space between those letters than there is perhaps in the Chancery. Now, speaking of Chancery, let me go to a very specific example, and I'm going to use a dip pen here and write out one word just to make sure you've got the idea. I'm going to write the word minimum. I did not make this up. I learned this from someone else. I'm not going to do a good job at it because I'm just going to do it really quick. There's the letter M. So I'm not in the zone. I'm not in that nice relax. I just want to knock this out really quickly. There's an M. There's an I. I'm going to put a dot there so we can recognize the I. There's an N. There's another I. We dot that. And here's an M. My pen is not behaving overly well. M-I-N-I-M-U. And then M. So I didn't do anything like this when I was teaching you each letter, one letter at a time, was I? Okay, again, you masters forgive me for that sloppiness. But there are a couple things that I want you to see in this sloppy example of a Chancery font. And that is that if I've done a good job, which I've done about a C+, but if I've done a good job, then first of all of my vertical strokes will be at the same angle. Most importantly, talking about spacing, most importantly, the space between each vertical heavy stroke will be very uniform. Does that make sense? Likewise, the light angles going at this angle are all at the same angle, and so on and so forth. So that is just one example of spacing. Let me go to, let's say, a black letter font. I'll just do a simple black letter. Here's a B. Here's a C. I'll go right through the alphabet. What we're going to want to make sure is that D is that our letters feel like they're making the same degree of grayness, like I talked here. Now the letter I is a much denser letter, so I might put just a little bit more space. Do you see how, if you were to measure how much space is between the C and the D versus between the D and the I, there's actually more space here. Why? Because the I, as I talked about earlier, is a more dense letter. And then if I went to an F, again, a fairly dense letter because it's very tall and thin. So again, more space there. And then if I went to an O, what's going to happen next? There's going to be less space, and I'm hoping you can see this. There's less space here than there is here. Why? Because an O is a more open letter. I think that's enough. I want you to nail that down. Look at examples of good calligraphy and pay special attention to this idea of spacing, a uniform degree of grayness throughout the word and throughout the line. I'm not even going to talk, I just wanted you to understand what leading was. The artistic feel of calligraphy will be affected greatly by how much space you put between one line of text and another. And again, there's no mathematical rule, it's all visual. This is an artistic, and you are an artist, so you're going to be able to do this really well. I'm glad you watched this. Thanks for working on your calligraphy.